The wind grew stronger and stronger, like blades that flashed towards Duan Ling Tian, leaving behind numerous tiny marks on Duan Ling Tian's face. These were all tiny injuries sliced open by the wind. But every time these tiny injuries appeared, they would be completely repaired by the flickering origin energy on Duan Ling Tian's body, and it seemed as if they'd never appeared. Meanwhile, strands of material azure-colored energy started to rage on Duan Ling Tian's body, and they accompanied his origin energy to seem to form gusts of clearly material azure-colored gales. These gusts of azure-colored gales coiled around Duan Ling Tian's body and seemed to have formed into a layer of a protective barrier that protected Duan Ling Tian within it. The fierce gale continued to sweep over and assault Duan Ling Tian, and they blasted onto the azure-colored gale and caused it to tremble. In the end, the fierce gale split apart into two and not a bit of it descended onto Duan Ling Tian. At the same time, a strange scene appeared. The wind concept that couldn't completely conform to his origin energy had actually started to conform more and more with his origin energy, and it seemed as if this was urged on by the wind that assaulted him from ahead. Speed up. Feng Wudao's noticed this change in the first possible moment, and he spoke out, causing the azure-eyed eagle to speed up once more. Not long after, the azure-eyed eagle's speed had risen to be comparable to a 6th-level void interpretation stage martial artist. The wind was even stronger, and the azure-colored strong winds around Duan Ling Tian's body showed signs of dispersal. Big Brother Duan. Even though Feng Wudao's beautiful face was still covered with worry, she was able to notice Duan Ling Tian's improvement now, and the wind concept seemed to be silently improving with every passing moment. At the beginning, the azure-colored gale that was formed from Duan Ling Tian's origin energy combined with wind concept had already showed signs of dispersion, yet later on, it calmed down once more. At the same time, the azure-colored gale became purer and purer. His wind concept had almost completely fused into his origin energy, and this feeling was as if it had transformed into wind. This feeling was similar to Zhan Xiaoyang's comprehension of earth concept and Bai Hao's comprehension of fire concept. They'd comprehended 9th-level elementary concept and were only half a step away for 1st-level intermediate concept. In other words, Duan Ling Tian was moving in that direction and he wasn't far away from them. If he improved a step further, the wind concept Duan Ling Tian had comprehended now was be able to completely materialize. The speed of the azure-eyed eagle was still increasing. Not long after, the azure-eyed eagle's speed had already increased to its full speed. Of course, this was only his full speed when only using his 7th-level void interpretation stage origin energy, and he hadn't utilized the concept he'd comprehended. Otherwise, his speed would be even faster. But even then, The current Duan Ling Tian was still fearless towards the piercingly cold gale that assaulted his face, because the wind concept that became more and more material around him had swallowed all the wind that assaulted his face. Continue. Feng Wu Dao spoke out. Whoosh. Fiery red energy swept out on the azure-eyed eagle's body before fusing into the origin energy that surrounded him, and it seemed to have transformed into real scorching flames. At this moment, the azure-eyed eagle seemed to have transformed into a flaming bird that caused patches of flaming clouds to appear everywhere it passed. Along with the azure-eyed eagle speeding up, the gale increased in strength was more, whereas the azure-colored gale that surrounded Duan Ling Tian's body showed signs of collapsing once more, yet it didn't collapse in the end, and it instead became even more flawless under the azure-eyed eagle's appropriate increase in speed. The more flawless the azure-colored gale was, it meant that the closer Duan Ling Tian's wind concept was to becoming material. Time flew by. 1 month later, the azure-colored gale on Duan Ling Tian's body had finally stabilized, and then it gradually withdrew itself to completely fuse into his body in the end. Meanwhile, even if he didn't have the protection of the azure-colored energy, the terrifying gale that assaulted his face seemed to be unable to affect Duan Ling Tian in the slightest. Duan Ling Tian opened his eyes and spread upon his arms, and his face was covered in a brilliant smile when facing the strong winds that assaulted his face. My concept has finally become material. Improving another step forward would be to attain first-level intermediate wind concept. Even though he was only half a step away from intermediate concept, Duan Ling Tian knew clearly in his heart that this moment was the most difficult. Elder Qing, thank you. Duan Ling Tian bowed towards the azure-eyed eagle's head as he expressed his gratitude with extreme sincerity. This expression of thanks was from the heart. Because Duan Ling Tian knew that if the azure-eyed eagle didn't cooperate with him, it would be impossible for him to allow his wind concept to complete the transformation to become material. Little fellow, besides Tian Wu, you're the person with the best comprehension ability I've ever seen. But Tian Wu possesses the fire spirit body, yet you don't possess the wind spirit body, so it's truly rare for you to be able to so quickly comprehend wind concept to such an extent. The azure-eyed eagle wasn't stingy with words of praise. Elder Qing, you're too kind. Duan Ling Tian spoke modestly. Subsequently, Duan Ling Tian turned around, leaving his back to face the gale that whistled over as he walked slowly to enter into the azure-eyed eagle's origin energy barrier. Congratulations, Big Brother Duan. Feng Tianwu congratulated Duan Ling Tian. Duan Ling Tian lightly smiled as he nodded, and then he looked at Feng Wu Dao and met his gaze. The words of thanks that he originally wanted to speak were stopped under the indication in Feng Wu Dao's gaze. Everything was said without speaking. Where are we now? Duan Ling Tian looked down towards the boundless ground that ceaselessly flashed beneath his feet, and he asked curiously. Big brother Duan, we've already left the Darkhan dynasty for over 10 days. This is the territory belonging to the Darming dynasty, and we'll be able to arrive at the capital of Darming dynasty in a few days. At that time, we'll rest there for a bit. Feng Tianwu was faintly exhausted as she spoke to Duan Ling Tian. Okay. Duan Ling Tian nodded, and he never imagined that when he awoke from the state of comprehending wind concept, they were already in another dynasty. Duan Ling Tian had once heard of the Darming dynasty when he was in the Darkhan dynasty. This was a dynasty situated at the northwest of the Darkhan dynasty, and the vastness of the area if occupied wasn't the slightest bit inferior to the Darkhan dynasty. Besides that, because it was even closer to the foreign lands than the Darkhan dynasty, the practice of cultivation in the Darming dynasty was even more formidable than the Darkhan dynasty, and there were more genius martial artists born in the Darming dynasty than the Darkhan dynasty. A few days later, the azure-eyed eagle's speed slowed down. Meanwhile, Duan Ling Tian looked down and a tiny black dot appeared within his field of vision, and along with the azure-eyed eagle getting closer, the tiny black dot became larger and larger before finally transforming into an enormous city that was like a colossus hibernating there. After they arrived outside the city, Duan Ling Tian was able to see the ancient city wall that surrounded the city. These walls emitted a feeling of ancientness at all times, and they seemed to be narrating the long history they existed in. Qing, we'll meet here 5 days from now. Feng Wu Dao notified the azure-eyed eagle before soaring up into the sky and leaving the back of the azure-eyed eagle first, whereas, Duan Ling Tian and Feng Tianwu followed behind him to soar up into the sky. Little girl Wu, little fellow. See you both again in 5 days. The azure-eyed eagle's sharp gaze flashed past Duan Ling Tian and Feng Tianwu before he transformed into a ball of flames that vanished before their eyes. He only left behind the flaming clouds that were gradually becoming faint. Let's go. Duan Ling Tian's group of 3 descended down from the sky and slowly walked in the Darming dynasty's capital along its front entrance. After walking into the capital of Darming dynasty, Duan Ling Tian was able to sense the atmosphere here that was different to the atmosphere in the Darkhan dynasty. The people they'd passed by all along the way obviously had tensed minds, and they seemed to be on guard against something at all times. Seeming to have discerned the bewilderment on Duan Ling Tian's face, Feng Tianwu explained. Big brother Duan, there are some people infatuated with cultivation that would frequently attack others arbitrarily in the capital of Darming dynasty, so it developed the mentality to always be on guard in the people of the Darming dynasty. Duan Lingtian came to a sudden understanding. As expected of a dynasty that's neighboring the foreign lands. In terms of prevalence of the practice of cultivation, it's indeed better than the Darkhan dynasty. This was something that Duan Lingtian had to admit. Duan Lingtian's group of 3 moved through the large streets in the capital and headed towards the center of the capital. At the same time, Duan Lingtian sized up the surroundings with mild curiousness. Swoosh! Suddenly, a wave of ear-piercing howls of the wind sounded out from afar and came closer and closer. Duan Lingtian's brows raised and couldn't help but look ahead, and he noticed a middle-aged man in gray clothes directly attacking 2 people that were walking together. Bang! Bang! 2 palm strikes struck out and instantly killed the 2 people. 3rd level of the void interpretation stage. Duan Lingtian frowned as he looked at the 40 ancient horned dragon silhouettes in the sky above the gray-clothed middle-aged man, as he never imagined that a void interpretation stage martial artist would launch a sneak attack against someone on the street. He didn't even utilize concept before killing those 2 people, so the disparity in their strengths was obvious. In next to no time, a wisp of a cold smile appeared on the corners of Duan Lingtian's mouth. Because he saw the gaze of the gray-clothed middle-aged man lock onto their group of 3, or more precisely speaking, it had locked onto Feng Tianwu. What a beautiful woman! You're mine. The gray-clothed middle-aged man soared into the sky and flew toward them, and his eyes were filled with lust, as if Feng Tianwu was already his. Presently, as he flashed over, his targets were aimed precisely at Duan Lingtian and Feng Wudao. Obviously, as far as he was concerned, so long as he killed Duan Lingtian and Feng Wudao, he would be able to possess Feng Tianwu. Duan Lingtian didn't move because there was no need. Early on, when the gray-clothed middle-aged man disrespected Feng Tianwu, Duan Lingtian had already noticed Feng Wudao's gaze become completely piercingly cold. So he knew that this Uncle Feng of his was infuriated. Whoosh! The gray-clothed middle-aged man utilized his concept when facing Duan Lingtian and Feng Wudao. His water concept fused into his origin energy and was completely material, causing his entire body to seem to have transformed into waves that slapped over fiercely. 9-layer waves. The gray-clothed middle-aged man shouted out explosively as his hands shook, and then his palms struck out. Instantly, the waves that slapped out towards them shot out in succession, and each was stronger than the previous. An entire 9 layers of waves had ceaselessly collided with each other, causing the layer of wave at the front to become more and more swifter and powerful, and in the blink of an eye, it had already arrived before Duan Lingtian and Feng Wudao. Die! The gray-clothed middle-aged man's gaze was icy cold and didn't possess the slightest emotion, as if he'd already seen the scene of Duan Ling Tian and Feng Wu Dao being slapped to death by his palm strikes.